way out in the boondocks. When you go there, you'll understand what I mean. And I've heard people say they're going to take tours to the crash site. Well, not the real crash site, not the debris field. You might be interested in knowing. There's a place you can go. If you go to Roswell, you can go to museums. There's two. 29,000 people have already this year visited the big museum. There is a site where you can take a bus tour to $15 a pop. The Corn Ranch. There is now a letter at the museum saying from people who lived on that ranch, whose family owned that area in 1947, they rode on horseback all over the place. There was never a word from the ranchers who did talk to each other. And you couldn't gain access with a vehicle to that site until after 1960. Only by horseback to that supposed site that Frank Kaufman says they drove right on up to. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as these facts become more known. Anyway, mogul balloon, we've known about it for many years. No reason to say there's any connection. The materials don't match. There's no evidence that one was launched at the right time to have been recovered in the right place. No evidence that the stuff in General Ramey's office was from a mogul balloon either. So it's garbage. Quite frankly, I used to say nice things about the Air Force. I've given up on that. They don't deserve it anymore. They're lying, and that bothers me. And they're lying to senators and congressmen. And that bothers me even more. It should bother you, too. When public, quote, servants lie to the public. I want to throw in a document just to get dull for a bit. Documents are what top secret magic is all about. You've seen all these documentaries on television. Isn't it amazing how few of them talk about documents? I mean, they have a pro and a con who go at each other for a bit, and they think they've covered the subject. You never hear them talk about documents, about large-scale scientific studies, about written information. This just happens to be a memo to Truman from George Marshall talking about Majestic 12. And as I discuss in the book, there are all kinds of reasons for saying this is genuine. It's important for one reason. President Truman considered George C. Marshall the outstanding living American. Marshall was Secretary of State in 1947. Remember the Marshall Plan? That was that George Marshall. It would have seemed perfectly appropriate, according to both the Marshall Archives and the Truman Archives, for Marshall to have been asked for advice by Truman. He knew all the military people. He was Chief of Staff during the entire Second World War. This memo would strongly indicate that that consultation took place, which makes perfectly good sense. It's a long story. It's in the book, but there are documents. And I always thought documentary, that word has something to do with documents and documenting. We see darn little of that in most television documentaries. I'll run through quick sources of information because I want to test you all. You will be asked to fill out a form after. Nah, you won't. Project Blue Book Special Report 14. Something I talk about in all my lectures, and something which is never talked about by the debunkers. There are four major rules for debunking. One, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Two, don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Three, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's a heck of a lot easier. And four, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is much too much trouble. And the public won't know the difference anyway. So, largest study ever done for the United States Air Force, of all people. 3,201 sightings. Quick look, I won't go into all the details. But for those of you who buy into the nonsense that only a small percentage of carefully investigated sightings remain unidentified after careful investigation, here's the categorization of 3,200 cases. That's a pretty good number. The ones we're interested in are the unknowns, 21.5%. Completely separate from the ones listed as insufficient information. Would you believe the Secretary of the Air Force, there's that word again, at the time this was released but not distributed in 1955, said, on the basis of this report, we believe no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. 3%? Thank you, it was 21.5. Not enough data? What the heck do you think that category is? Insufficient information. It was a double lie, and it's been repeated many times since. I think it's time they stopped lying. I respect security. I worked under it for 14 years. Here's the quality evaluation, another lie from the noisy negativist. There's no difference between the cases that can't be explained and those that can be explained, right? No. There's a very major difference. The better the quality of the report, the more likely to be unexplainable. And yet Carl Sagan had the gall to say that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable, there are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but there are no interesting and reliable sightings. Sounding very profound, with not the slightest reference to any facts or data on which those statements are based, and with clear data from the Air Force proving that the statement is nonsense. It's exactly the opposite of the truth. You will notice the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unknown. Exactly what you'd expect if the unknowns were really something different, and exactly the opposite of what the skeptics try to tell you. If you're going to make a pronouncement, let's get two quick sources of information. I use this slide because the author, Dick Hall, of the UFO evidence is here in the room, I think. Dick, you here? Well, he was out in the hall. Okay. And there's going to be a new version of this coming out sometime soon. The UFO evidence on the left, for those who say there is no data, only anecdotes, 746 sightings that couldn't be identified, sifted out from 4,500 cases investigated by the old NICAP. And there were separate chapters on sightings by police officers, by military pilots, by commercial pilots, by scientists, engineers, astronomers, and an excellent chapter on intelligent control of some UFOs. How many people have read the UFO evidence? Say yes, I can't see. Oh, about 5, okay. If Dick were here, of course, there'd be another since he wrote it. How many have read Blue Book Special Report 14, the previous report? 1, 2, 3, 4. Hotbed of scientific ufology here. 4's a big number. When you have a crowd of 500 and nobody has, then you know you're in trouble, you know. On the right, Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects, hearings before the Committee on Science and Astronautics. We really need to move that back about 10 feet, but it won't. No, you can't. Oh, well, too bad. Congressional hearings on my birthday, July 29th, 1968. Testimony from 12 scientists. I was the only one without a PhD. The best paper by far was one by the late Dr. James E. McDonald, a professor of physics at the University of Arizona. I consider him the outstanding UFO researcher of the last 40 years anyway. Jim personally interviewed over 500 witnesses. These are almost all pre-screened cases, so he spent his time on the unknowns rather than on the knowns. To make a very long story short, he concluded flying saucers is the most challenging scientific problem of our time. Some UFOs are of extraterrestrial origin, and the Air Force Project Blue Book effort was completely inadequate from a scientific viewpoint. Then he presented information on 41 cases. It's a 70-page paper, subdivided into 6 groups, each group dealing with the typical objection of the uninformed, noisy negativist. Half a dozen sightings by multiple witness cases, let's call it that. Multiple witness cases. Half a dozen radar cases. Half a dozen sightings over big cities. A bunch of sightings by the professionals who watch the sky, the astronomers, the pilots, the meteorologists. Outstanding